Hi everyone, we're on to topic 8, which is justice movements. And this is where we've moved beyond the different perspectives of justice as different ideas of what justice is, to looking at some of the ways in which justice manifests itself in society. And obviously we have a legal system that has its own point of view and its own perspective on what justice is. And there is a relationship between the justice system and the rest of society. So over the years, there's been regular situations where people see the system as unjust, unfair, and social movements develop around the impetus to affect change, to apply pressure. Sometimes it's through peaceful protest and threat to, remove a government, vote against a government in favour of one that's promising to provide a more just society, however you measure that. And sometimes it gets down to violence. And the French Revolution is probably one of the clearest examples of the times in history where people totally gave into the frustration and decided to chop off the head, rise up as a mob and chop off the heads of all the rulers. Of course, things went bad pretty quickly for the revolution, and then we had the terror. But I think it's always been a high watermark because that was the first time monarchs and rulers in Europe really began to appreciate that this could happen here as well. So we need to be able to we don't want to change, we don't want to give people more freedom or equality or any of those sorts of things, but occasionally we might have to, because at the end of the day people can get very frustrated and we might have a mob coming for us. And that resonates very much today, and we see the same sort of calls for justice. Whether or not the foundation of that justice is legitimate from our point of view, that's something else. But with the insurrection in the United States, it was pretty much the same sort of thing. There were people calling to lynch Mike Pence, the vice president, because he certified the results of the election, which said that Biden had won the election. And there were people with gallows and ropes and guys running into the Capitol building with a fistful of twist ties to find hostages. Ultimately, the violence that was done was against the security staff and against Nancy Pelosi's desk, I guess. But there was the spectre of the French Revolution was very strong there, both for the people who were fearful of there being bloodshed, or more bloodshed than there was, and for the people caught up in the spirit of revolution who thought that they were fighting for the right. They believed that Trump had won the election and somehow it had been stolen from him, and that this was a way of affecting change and justice for all. So we see this a lot in current day. We see returns to this idea of at what point are people going to be pushed to the point of violence? What's the response to that violence going to be? And what is the difference between something like a popular revolution where justice is mostly on the side of the revolutionaries, and at what point is this just mob rule? At what point is the situation just giving in to the loudest voices or the voices of the majority? And one of the reasons that democracy exists is democracy isn't mob rule. It isn't the rule by the most people or by the most powerful or violent of people. One of the concepts of democracy that often gets forgotten in these debates is that democracy is about protecting everyone, and it's very much often about protecting the minority from the majority. So you see people, particularly on Facebook, always saying, well, if the most of the people in society believe in it, then that's what should happen. And our concept of things like rule of law and our concept of rights in democracy is really about protecting people from those large mobs, and acknowledging that there are plenty of situations in which just because you're in a minority doesn't mean that you don't, you should give in to the majority. There are plenty of situations, if you have a society where you've got a large portion of racists, just because they might outnumber the people that they're being racist about doesn't mean that they are right and entitled to be racist. If you've got a concept of rule of law and equality in that country, then that's a more important right than the right of the majority to have their way. But we do see that confused again and again and again in discourse, particularly social media discourse, where people believe that they are entitled to pick on minorities because they are a majority. And they call that democracy, which certainly is not. I mean, democracy has a process via which representatives are chosen, and the representatives are chosen by a popular vote. But that's a very different concept from saying that everything that those representatives do and everything that majority does is therefore right. All right. So the idea of the balance of democracy and populism, it's not going away anywhere. We're going to see, particularly with there's a whole slate of elections, starting with the US elections coming up. We're going to see more complexity in this and more debate, amplified by social media as to what is justice, what is the correct answer. I've referred to a few historical movements in the notes that I think are worth thinking about. Particularly the first one I would talk about is the workers' movements that really gained prominence during the English Civil War. So this is well before the French Revolution. And there was a real groundswell of where industrialization was happening, of movements to protect the rights of workers as individuals, where people were being moved out of their farms and areas where they had more control into factories where they were dangerous, they had no control over their conditions or whatever. And you saw workers' rights movements such as the Diggers become very powerful forces, and they were very influential in the English Civil War, which saw the king displaced and replaced by Parliament. Unfortunately, Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the the parliamentary group, the anti-monarchy group, very swiftly betrayed the workers' movements who his rise to power had been supported by, and slaughtered them, and basically subjected everyone to rule that was pretty much just as cruel as the king that had come before him. Except he banned Christmas and banned dancing and all sorts of other things, banned the theatre. And that's, I think it's a pattern we see throughout history, where you have popular-based workers' movements who mobilise against tyranny, but then get co-opted and ultimately betrayed by another authoritarian group who seizes control, using them and then betraying them. The Soviet Revolution, another example, and all the way down the track to even like small areas of change. We have to be constantly vigilant of the kind of people who get drawn to areas of change and who use the rhetoric and ideas around these justice movements for their own ends. The civil rights movement we talk about a little bit, and that's, I think, one of the examples we often use for a social justice movement, because it was a very significant and very clear-cut example of injustice, of racism, particularly the Jim Crow laws that were discriminatory-based laws, popular in parts of in parts of the South in the United States, and also popular with Adolf Hitler, who thought that the American model of subjugating minorities was a great way to do government, and Hitler spoke quite often about how much he admired the United States. But eventually we saw a popular, peaceful civil rights movement be able to make a transition and be able to, I don't know if force is quite the right word, but to compel or shame government into recognising civil rights and doing something about those problems. And I think possibly because of the peaceful nature of the civil rights movement, even though so many of their leaders were assassinated, I think it was harder to corrupt and harder for something like the Terror or the English Civil War to happen, where you had people co-opting the movement because the movement was being peaceful. There was no force for them to corrupt and subvert. Another example that's similar, I've talked about post-colonial movements, and I think India is an example, and Gandhi's idea of non-violent protest, of peaceful protest, was the strength that got the British out of India. Unfortunately, as a sort of a parting shot when they went out the door, the British partitioned India into India and Pakistan, and basically fueled the divisions in the country, which was now two countries, and created more problems. It was a bit like doing a mic drop and setting off a bomb as you leave the room. And that's led to some interesting recognition of the difficulty that people have in throwing off an old system that's unfair and then trying to replace it with something that's better. And the movement I'm referring to here is under the loose umbrella of post-colonial movements. And what they have in common is that there are a lot of countries around the world that have been conquered by European colonial masters, have really struggled in the once they reach independence. And again, we're talking about countries here, but I think it's the same with any sort of social justice movement, that sometimes getting you what you want can lead to even more problems because because of the fact you're not in a position to just replace the old system with something that is better, fairer, that serves the interest of justice. So particularly the British Empire were very good very efficient as colonial masters. It's like, the Empire from Star Wars. But they were very efficient, and what they did was what they customarily did was draw on the rivalries and conflict that were already existent within a country and amplify them while they were ruling it, to basically set everyone against each other, so that they would not be able to ally together against the British. And all the European colonial powers were pretty bad, but the British were very, very efficient at doing this. So in India, for example, they set the Muslims against the Hindus, against the Sikhs, and basically fueled any of the religious differences quite deliberately, and in a way that the countries and the regions still suffering from today. They would redraw maps. They would resettle people in different territories. They would take territory off of someone that customarily owned it, give it to a rival, so that would create resentment and that would create conflict within the group. As I said, it's efficient and an utterly evil way to control an empire. But what it meant was that as the British Empire collapsed and they lost their ability to control all these countries around the world, they would leave and they would say, okay, we're out the door now. Now you guys are on your own. You have to rule yourselves. And these are people who'd been ruled under this approach for decades, who didn't necessarily have the resources, the skills, the capacity to jump straight into self-rule, and were already dealing with these entrenched conflicts between different groups that generally pre-existed the colonial powers, but were definitely made worse. So Africa is another example of a continent. Basically anywhere in the south of the world, South America, and Southern Asia, Africa, are all examples of countries that in the 19th century were all grabbed up by powerful colonial powers from Europe, and the corporate powers that were co-ruling those territories, and have then ended up in difficulty in re-establishing themselves. So this movement is generally called post-colonialism, and it generally has allies across different countries because they've all had the same sort of experience. But it's been in that ability to try and unpack, and they talk about decolonizing, that ability to try and undo all that programming and all that conflict that the colonial powers created, which is obviously not easy. And it's particularly not easy because a lot of the corporations that were co-ruling with the colonial governments are still there. And they still own the property, and they're still benefiting from what we often call neo-colonialism, where we've got sort of a corporate colonial order that's hard to undo. So if you've got a country that's ruled by colonial power, and they sell off all the petrochemical resources to a corporation, and then you've got to transition to the colonial power leaves, you got to transition to this new form of power. Quite often they don't get to renegotiate those resources. That they're stuck with this unfair sale of the resources that were done in the colonial times. And when they do try to undo it, they try to use government power or force to force the corporations out. You then end up seeing a whole lot of the chicanery that goes on, where governments are backing counter-revolutionary rebels on behalf of the corporations. And there's I'm trying to remember the series that Adam Curtis did. I'll try to remember it and post it in Teams. But Adam Curtis, the documentary maker, did a great one on Africa that looked at how in the 1950s Africa was poised to be a major series of world powers, and there was a whole lot of optimism around decolonisation and this new change, and basically a whole lot of intelligence agencies got in and undermined those new governments in order to protect these kind of hegemonic interests from the West. And it's very sad. And I think one of the reasons why in the Marvel universe, why Wakanda is so resonant for a lot of people, because in the 50s it looked like Africa was going to be some Wakandas. There was a whole series of optimism and this idea that throwing off the colonial rulers was going to lead to this very, very vibrant, productive techno-utopia that would come out of Africa in different countries. And of course, a lot of places just collapsed into civil war and all these other problems. So that's post-colonialism. That's a very, very general introduction to post-colonialism. But again, that's a series of social justice movements that have been about trying to dig a bit deeper into, the long-lasting effects of what injustice can do to people, and what generational trauma, generational dispossession can do to people. Another example. There's another couple of examples in the book. There's the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think is another interesting example of a very recent social movement, of a non-violent social movement, and how that sort of got entangled into the politics of pandemic and politics of sort of party politics of the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. But a movement which I think, because it was decentered and it doesn't have a centralized control that happens in sort of a network effect, I think has been more resilient, has had much more longevity, because it hasn't had a centralized hierarchy or control that can be attacked or resisted. So obviously things aren't. It's still slow progress for Black Lives Matter, but a whole lot of the issues around police violence, around systemic violence, around generational trauma, generational inequity, I think have come to the fore in a way that they hadn't before, due to the way the movement was organised. And the last of the justice movements that I refer to is the movements from First Nations Australia. Now, clearly, you'll be doing much more about this in other units, and particularly for criminology students, you'll be looking at the Indigenous Australians and the criminal justice system. But that's another interesting example of a movement which is it's not like a sovereignty movement where you've got a dispossessed king who wants to, and a ruler and a group of people who want to replace the government. It's a multi-fronted movement. So, part of it involves the land rights movement and the movement to recognise customary laws, particularly customary property laws. Some of it involves resistance around black deaths in custody and the conditions in prison. Some of it revolves around, as we saw, the unsuccessful Voice to Parliament move and the debate over what is the appropriate way to recognise Indigenous voice. And, without trying to unpack that complex issue in a limited time we have here, I mean, the failure of the Voice to Parliament movement could easily be interpreted as, popular Australia, mainstream Australia does not want a voice to Parliament. But it also can be interpreted as the form of voice that was being presented was inappropriate. And there were plenty of, there were at least some, no, plenty is the right word, but there were Indigenous activists who at the time were saying, no, don't vote yes, because we don't think this is a good model. So in terms of looking at Australian First Nations people, we don't really have one centralised justice movement. We have lots of different themed movements that have broad senses of alliances and alliances to other social justice movements. And again, I think that is more resilient in the same way that the Black Lives Matter movement has become resilient, because it doesn't have a central authority. It doesn't have a central organisation that can be taken down or destroyed or discredited or whatever. So we live in an interesting time for justice movements. The last thing I want to mention in this little talk is, we are also seeing the dark side of justice movements. We are seeing things like the insurrection. And it is very hard to adopt it's hard to adopt an impartial, objective stance on anything involving justice. As we've seen throughout this term, there's not one perspective on justice, and everyone's perspective will come into clash, usually with someone else's perspective. But I do think we are seeing, with the rise of alt-right in America, a lot of the tools and mechanisms that were developed for things like the progressive social movements, particularly the civil rights movement, being co-opted and used towards different agendas. And those agendas are not so focused on equality. In fact, they're explicitly anti-equality in many ways. So I think, it's dispiriting to look at some of these movements and to see how successful they've been, particularly using, techniques that have been carefully developed by progressive protesters. But if you try and adopt a more objective approach to it, I think we can understand them a bit more. And understanding is, as far as I'm concerned, the pathway to avoiding some of the harms that are involved, and being able to, rather than just resist with outright force and to say, we need to use the same techniques that the government used against the civil rights movement, against these new right movements, because obviously that didn't work with the civil rights movement. And they killed so many leaders of the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement was still successful. So meeting justice movements with force produces more resistance, produces martyrs. It produces people, like Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, is an icon of the civil rights movement. He was it when he was alive, but even more so after he's died. And unfortunately that happened. But using the same kind of counterinsurgency, counter political movement force against these new right movements, against the insoles, and against the boogie boys that want the second civil war to happen, against all those sort of people, the preppers. It's just going to dig them further in, because they've learnt a lot from looking at progressive movements. So something we can talk about a little more in class next week, I guess. But I think overall, what I'm hoping you get from today is that idea that justice ideas of themselves don't do anything in isolation. You just got an idea of what justice is, and we have to see how justice movements can turn those ideas into action. And we need to look at the broad range of consequences and philosophies and beliefs that come out of that it's not just a case of we agree with everyone who wants justice, because for some people their idea of justice is going to be very harmful to other people. And how do we manage that? So some deep and meaningful themes coming out of this week, but I think it's important for us to think about those.